Chapter 7. The Man with Red Eyes. "We knew we were going to be in danger," Charles Wallace said. "Mrs. Whatsit told us that." "Yes, and she told us that it was going to be worse for you than for Meg and me, and that you must be careful. You stay right here with Meg, old sport. Let me go in and case the joint and then report to you." "No," Charles Wallace said firmly. "She told us to stay together. She told us not to go off by ourselves." "She told you not to go off by yourself. I'm the oldest, and I should go in first." "No." Meg's voice was flat. "Charles is right, Cal. We have to stay together. Suppose you didn't come out and we had to go in after you." "Come on. Let's hold hands if you don't mind." Holding hands, they crossed the square. The huge Central Intelligence Building had only one door, but it was an enormous one, at least 2 stories high and wider than a room, made of a dull, bronze-like material. "Do we just knock?" Meg giggled. Calvin studied the door. "There isn't any handle or knob or latch or anything. Maybe there's another way to get in." "Let's try knocking anyhow," Charles said. He raised his hand, but before he touched the door, it slid up from the top and to each side, splitting into 3 sections that had been completely invisible a moment before. The startled children looked into a great entrance hall of dull, grainy marble. Marble benches lined 3 of the walls. People were sitting there like statues. The green of the marble, reflecting on their faces, made them look bilious. They turned their heads as the door opened, saw the children, looked away again. "Come on," Charles said, and, still holding hands, they stepped in. As they crossed the threshold, the door shut silently behind them. Meg looked at Calvin and Charles, and they, like the waiting people, were a sickly green. The children went up to the blank 4th wall. It seemed unsubstantial, as though one might almost be able to walk through it. Charles put out his hand. "It's solid and icy cold." Calvin touched it too. "Ugh." Meg's left hand was held by Charles, her right by Calvin, and she had no desire to let go of either of them to touch the wall. "Let's ask somebody something." Charles led them over to one of the benches. Could you tell us what's the procedure around here?" he asked one of the men. The men all wore nondescript business suits, and though their features were as different one from the other as the features of men on Earth, there was also a sameness to them. Like the sameness of people riding in a subway, Meg thought. Only on a subway, every once in a while, there's somebody different, and here there isn't. The man looked at the children warily. "The procedure for what?" "How do we see whoever's in authority?" Charles asked. "You present your papers to the A machine. You ought to know that," the man said severely. "Where is the A machine?" Calvin asked. The man pointed to the blank wall. "But there isn't a door or anything," Calvin said. "How do we get in?" "You put your S papers in the B slot," the man said. "Why are you asking me these stupid questions? Do you think I don't know the answers? You'd better not play any games around here, or you'll have to go through the process machine again, and you don't want that." "We're strangers here," Calvin said. "That's why we don't know anything, or don't know about things. Please tell us, sir, who are you and what you do?" "I run a number 1 spelling machine on the 2nd grade level." "But what are you doing here now?" Charles Wallace asked. "I'm here to report that one of my letters is jamming, and until it can be properly oiled by an F-grade oiler, there's danger of jammed mines." "Strawberry jam or raspberry?" Charles Wallace murmured. Calvin looked down at Charles and shook his head warningly. Meg gave the little boy's hand a slight, understanding pressure. Charles Wallace, she was quite sure, was not trying to be rude or funny. It was his way of whistling in the dark. The man looked at Charles sharply. "I think I shall have to report you. I'm fond of children due to the nature of my work, and I don't like to get them in trouble, but rather than run the risk myself of reprocessing, I must report you." "Maybe that's a good idea," Charles said. "Who do you report us to?" "To whom do I report you?" "Well, to whom then? I'm not on the 2nd grade level yet." I wish he wouldn't act so sure of himself, Meg thought, looking anxiously at Charles and holding his hand more and more tightly until he wriggled his fingers in protest. That's what Mrs. Whatsit said he had to watch, being proud. Don't. Please don't. She thought hard at Charles Wallace. She wondered if Calvin realized that a lot of the arrogance was bravado. The man stood up, moving jerkily as though he had been sitting for a long time. Hope he isn't too hard on you, he murmured as he led the children toward the empty fourth wall. But I've been reprocessed once, and that was more than enough. And I don't want to get sent to IT, or to it. I've never been sent to it, and I can't risk having that happen. There was it again. What was this it? The man took from his pocket a folder filled with papers of every color. He shifted through them carefully, finally withdrawing one. I've had several reports to make lately. I shall have to ask for a requisition for more A21 cards. He took the card and put it against the wall. It slid through the marble as though it were being sucked in and disappeared. You may be detained for a few days, the man said, but I'm sure they won't be too hard on you because of your youth. Just relax and don't fight, and it will be all much easier for you. He went back to his seat, leaving the children standing and staring at the blank wall. And suddenly, the wall was no longer there, and they were looking into an enormous room lined with machines. They were not unlike the great computing machines Meg had seen in her science books and that she knew her father sometimes worked with. Some did not seem to be in use. In others, lights were flickering on and off. In one machine, a long tape was being eaten. In another, a series of dot dashes were being punched. Several white-robed attendants were moving about, tending the machines. If they saw the children, they gave no sign. Calvin muttered something. What? Meg asked him. There's nothing to fear except fear itself, Calvin said. I'm quoting. Like Mrs. Who. Meg, I'm scared stiff. So am I. Meg held his hand more tightly. Come on. They stepped into the room with the machines. In spite of the enormous width of the room, it was even longer than it was wide. Perspective made the long rows of machines seem almost to meet. The children walked down the center of the room, keeping as far from the machines as possible. Though I don't suppose they're radioactive or anything, Charles Wallace said, or that they're going to reach out and grab us and chew us up. After they had walked for what seemed like miles, they could see that the enormous room did have an end, and that at the end there was something. Charles Wallace said suddenly, and his voice held panic, Don't let go my hands! Hold me tight! He's trying to get at me!